You are listening to The Main Phase, episode 107, a Magic the Gathering podcast that is all things standard all the time. Today, Jeremy will give a field report of his 5-0 Angels list, and we have a discussion on our deck building philosophies and strategies. Stay tuned. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. This is Debo from Land Say Go, and you're listening to The Main Phase, a Magic the Gathering podcast bringing new archetypes to the standard meta. I am joined this week by our co-host, Jeremy. How you doing today, JB?
Good, Debo.
Hey, so what are we talking about this week?
This week, I will give a field report for my 5-0 Mono White Angels list, and then we're going to go into our deck building philosophies for standard.
Awesome. So, as you were saying, you brought a mono white Angels list, and that can be found online, right?
Yeah, it's on Angels Wings. It was actually the article that I posted on Friday. Custom Brew put it together. A fantastic list, ended up doing a lot better than I thought it was. Just as a quick field report, again, went 5-0 with it. My first three opponents were all running some form of blue-black surveil, shenanigans, various types of control methodologies. I think what ended up kind of catching them off guard was how new to the meta this was. Oftentimes, and again, you know, we had discussed this before, but there's a good chance that I could have gone 1-4 if I take this deck again to a Friday Night Magic, right?
Yep. You know, really is just kind of the luck of the draw, but it does seem like, you know, you have a pretty good curve here.
You know, I think it really all starts with Healer's Hawk, right? Healer's Hawk ends up being this, well, that bird just does work, right? You know,
and for those who don't know, Healer's Hawk, a 1 white mana, 1/1 flyer with lifelink.
It's been seeing a lot of play in red-white weenies. It's seeing a lot of play in white weenies as well. But Healer's Hawk ends up being just perfect to fit into our curve. In the 2-drop slot, I've got Silverbeak Griffin, 2 white for a 2/2 flyer. Can only be found in the Ajani Planeswalker deck, a special printed card for M19 in that Ajani Planeswalker deck.
And then you were also running 4 Resplendent Angel.
That card ends up just being a tremendous powerhouse. It becomes a late-game threat early in the game, and specifically, let me go further into the list here, but we were also running 4 Ajani, right? So that's our 1-2-3-4 punch, all right? That's our 1-2-3-4 punch. We're going left hook, right hook, body with that, right? It is the type of curve that just gets you there. And what this deck does really well is that people think that's the game you're running. That's the whole show, right? We turn 1 Healer's Hawk, turn 2 Griffin, turn 3 Resplendent Angel, turn 4 Ajani. We get priority until we tick up Ajani and we put 2 +1/+1 counters on some creatures. Okay. The 2/2 Beak becomes, or Silverbeak becomes a 3/3. The 1/1 Hawk becomes a 2/2, and we're swinging in for 8 damage when we'd already previously done damage in 2 different combat steps. It is abrasive. And in the event that they burn 1-for-1 removal in any instance, red, black, doesn't really matter, those removal packages don't really stand up well in the face of a card like Ajani, which can just return that Healer's Hawk or that Silverbeak Griffin directly back to the battlefield on the -2 tick down. So what we've got here is a deck that really appears to be a white aggro list that is backed up by Ajani. But at the top of our curve, we start dropping cards like Lyra Dawnbringer. We start dropping Sarah's Guardian. We start dropping Light of the Legion.
So we all might know Lyra is a 5/5 with lifelink, first strike, and flying for 5 mana, but what about Sarah's Guardian? What's it cost? What does it bring?
4 colorless, 2 white for a 5/5 flyer with vigilance that says all other creatures you control gain vigilance.
Dang. And then what about Light of the Legion? What does that one do?
Light of the Legion, 4 colorless, 2 white for a 5/5 flyer that mentors. It says when it dies, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control.
Wow. And then, so I guess with Lyra, you're also getting that +1/+1, or the angels you control get +1/+1
Correct.
and lifelink.
And we're gaining lifelink.
Dang.
So when you look at the Resplendent Angel curve there, right? So Resplendent Angel's in play. We get a lifelinking Hawk in play. Let's say Ajani's already put a couple +1/+1 counters on those, and we resolve a Lyra at 3 copies in the deck. The Resplendent Angel then begins generating tokens without having to run the 6 mana through it. Resplendent Angel is a 3/3 naturally with flying. Says you can run 3 colorless and 3 white through it on its ability to give it +2/+2 and lifelink. And then it also has a clause that says if you've gained 5 or more life this turn, at your end step, put a 4/4 flying angel token into play.
So with that card, it just matters whenever you gain the life, not if it was on the battlefield at the time you gain the life, correct?
Correct.
Just so long as it's on the battlefield at the end of the turn.
That's right. So if we have a resolved Resplendent Angel, a resolved Lyra, and any number of our top curve angels, well, it's pretty self-explanatory what starts happening here. It becomes abrasive, oppressive, really, really quickly. Let me dive into a couple of the cards that we use to supplement that combat strategy and to supplement a Johnny, because ultimately what it becomes about here, and what we've really got here, is a deck that stabilizes you and tries to protect a Johnny to get to his ultimate. A lot of people, we've had this conversation, a lot of people say that it's not necessarily a game-ending ultimate, but it is. It just becomes...
So what is his ultimate? What does it do?
His ultimate's a -7, puts an emblem into play that says during your end step, you put 3/1/1 lifelink cat tokens into play.
Dang.
If you've ever played with Liliana, right, from Eldritch Moon, and you get her ultimate off, and you're just getting, X+2 zombies each turn, it feels a lot like that. The zombies don't have lifelink. Right. So you begin getting these huge swings and curves, right? Which also brings a really substantial line in terms of the argumentation on the second version of this deck. I might try to make it, since we are really ultimately just trying to defend ourselves to get to a Johnny's emblem, I might try to make it a Divine Visitation deck. I even comment on that in the article. A Johnny emblem with Divine Visitation in play is hilarious. It's hilarious. With a resolved Divine Visitation and a Lyra with a Johnny's emblem in play is awful.
I would just scoop at that point.
There's no way to come back from that. The emblem's untouchable.
But if, let's say you do have that, and I'm your opponent, and I have, say, a Cleansing Nova, how do you get past that, right?
You don't. At that point, you would just end up wiping the board, unless, of course, I cast Make a Stand, which is a sleeper card here, right? Everybody, against the opponents, again, I played blue-black 3 times, and all of them boarded in Ritual of Soot, and... they caught me with a couple of them, but we were able to bounce back pretty reliably. But I was able to fend off a couple of those with Make a Stand, and it is not a card that your opponent is expecting you to play.
So Make a Stand, for those who don't know, is 2 and a white for an instant that says creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn, and then they gain indestructible until end of turn. So what Jeremy's saying here is if they cast a board sweep, well...
Destroy all creatures.
Destroy all creatures. Well, then you cast Make a Stand. It gives them indestructible. And you get to relish in the look of your opponent's disappointment when all your creatures still stay around.
I mean, there is really a lot to be said about some of the choices there, and I'll run through these pretty quickly again in an effort to get us to the latter portion of what I think the podcast is about today. I'm very happy to have the 5-0 report. As with all things, I was running really hot. During Friday Night Magic this last Friday. And you could take this very same list and go 3-2 or 1-4. It just really kind of depends upon the heart of the cards. But I think I've stabilized the curve well. We got Seal Away, a 1 colorless, 1 white flash, exile target tapped creature until Seal Away leaves the battlefield. It's an enchantment. We got Ixalan's Binding. I think that's a powerhouse card. I've touched on this in the podcast before. A well-placed Ixalan's Binding ends the game in most cases.
And you were even telling me against some of your blue-black opponents that they would go to cause you to discard the things from your hand, and instead of choosing Ixalan's Binding, they would choose, say, a Silverbeak Griffin or a Resplendent Angel.
They were trying to tamp down the aggro because they had played that first game, right? Brought in the Thought Erasures. 1 blue, 1 black, look at target opponent's hand. They discard a non-land card, very good card, and then surveil, right? But yes, they were not going after the binding. They left it there and gave me the option to keep it, which most of the time was their hero's downfall, if you will. Sorry for that was pretty bad. But anyway, the 25 lands.
And then you also had another removal spell in here that you told me earlier was
I almost forgot. Yeah, Gideon's Reproach. Yeah, man. Instant speed, 1 colorless, 1 white. Certainly not Blessed Alliance.
Right.
But 1 colorless, 1 white deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Talk about being able to mitigate the Steel Leaf Champion threat, to be able to mitigate any of the Drake threats, right? To be able to reliably handle a number of the early problems.
Only 2 mana.
For only 2 mana, and it's at instant speed, and I also board more of those in. I also ran Remorseful Cleric in the sideboard, 1 colorless, 1 white, 2/1 flyer, sacrifice Remorseful Cleric, exile all cards from our target opponent's graveyard.
And what I really like about that too is when you're playing that with a Johnny, you can get him back with this -2 ability.
That is correct.
To bring back a creature with mana cost 2 less. to the battlefield.
It's like I thought about it.
I know, right?
It's like I thought about it. And with all these recursive things going on with the Golgari and then the blue-red mid-range stuff with the Arclight Phoenix, there is nothing better than a recursive Tormod's Crypt to handle a lot of those decks, right? And that's what Remorseful Cleric becomes with a Johnny. It's a very, very strong, capable deck. We also run some Settle the Wreckage in there and then Karn for tempo.
And then it also looks like you have 4 Adonto Vanguard. How does that play into your deck?
You know, most of the time I would just drop the Sealaways and the Gideon's Reproach in the event that I wanted to be a little lower to the ground. Most of the time that's, again, against a control meta like Niv Mizzet. You know, there's a lot of Grixis, a lot of blue-red Niv Mizzet decks that are pretty much nothing but removal and counter spells and 4 copies of Niv Mizzet that are out there right now. And the one thing that those decks cannot reliably handle is a 2-drop that can make itself indestructible and swings in for 3 every turn. Because we're gaining the life back here, right? So I would go more aggro with it. And again, 5-0 performance, very, very happy with it.
Oh, hey, that's awesome. So again, everybody, you can find this list on www.landsaygo.com. It's underneath our article section as well as our deck tech section. So if you want to see the full list in its entirety, plus a write-up on how to play the deck and some of the cool synergies that we didn't quite touch on here, you can find that there at www.landsaygo.com.
We named the deck On Angel's Wings. Fantastically fun, pretty budget-friendly. Give it a crack.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into our main topic of discussion today. So I know you and I, we like to bounce off each other every week.
That's pretty much how we do it.
Yeah, we come up with a different idea every week, and we trade off those ideas. And so what I'd like to discuss this week is basically have a philosophical discussion about how we like to build our decks in Standard.
Okay.
And what types of principles or rules we set for ourselves when we discover like what cards we want to put in there, what the ratios of these cards should be.
All right.
What types of lands we should put, that type of thing.
Yeah, this is exciting. How do you want to start?
Well, let's go ahead and just kind of take a look at how do we even come up with our ideas for our deck?
Well, best way to say that is something catches our attention. There's a card. There's, all right. When we get into new sets, we are always getting new keywords, maybe a return of certain keywords. Maybe there's some cards that immediately catch our eye because we've been playing with other cards and it's just the piece that is missing, right? When I say it's the piece that's missing, what's the first card that comes to your mind from the most recent set?
Lands. We're missing something for the lands deck.
Exactly. We're missing the other side of the shocks, right? So just having the capability to put dual lands, true dual lands, named dual lands into play and smooth out so much of that multicolored capability gives us the ability to now roll into, instead of 2-color decks, 3 and 4-color decks.
Maybe even 5-color.
Maybe even 5-color decks. And there's some really powerful 5-color strategies out there. Joda, the Eternal Archmage, comes to mind. Right?
Rainbow Lich is a popular archetype right now that could only benefit from having even more dual color lands.
Specifically, I think of cards, well, it harkens back to days of old, I guess, but I think of cards like Maze's End, right? And what is yet to be revealed from Ravnica Allegiance in terms of what is going to actually happen with these gates, right?
Or even the next set after that.
Yeah, or the next set after that. I mean, what potential legends, what dual-colored cards, what new strategies and combos can we find? And most of the time, I think WotC does a pretty good job of ensuring that the mythic cards are the ones that guide the play. But it's not always that case. Most of the time, you can find real value in game-winning strategies and uncommons and even bulk rares where maybe you can take the meta by surprise by finding a combo or something that's just so unique that while it's fresh, it's winning games until people adapt to it and find a way to crush that strategy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also, at least for me, when I look at the meta, I like to see what cards are being played, and then I play the exact opposite. I don't necessarily like I don't like to play the cards that everyone's playing because I know they're good. I want to try to find how to make a card that's being underutilized, how to make that good.
There is nothing better than playing a deck that you know can win, that your opponent, because they're so deeply rooted in the meta, has no idea what you're doing on the other side of the table until it's all revealed. Right. And then they see the combo and they see the pieces hit the table and then they realize that they're up S Creek without a paddle. Right. They know that they're up there. And there ain't no coming back. They're floating away, right?
So what kind of cards do we look towards to build a new deck around? Is there, like, for you, do you like to play meta cards, or do you like to play ones with specifically unique abilities? Like, how do you find those cards?
Well, my favorite archetype in the history of Magic is what, Debo?
Green ramp.
Ramp, right. So ramp specifically, being able to possess enough raw mana power to cast anything in my hand and cast it reliably and quickly is something that I will always seek. So for me personally, I always hedge my bets by running more lands than I probably should. Okay. But when I can get those lands into play faster than I should be able to and then resolve big spells, I mean, in the last 3 years, my favorite deck, hands down, was green-red Eldrazi ramp back in the Battle for Zendikar days, right?
Yeah, you were running that almost every week.
Yeah, it was reliably almost every week. It kind of broke my heart a little bit. I understand why they did ban Aetherworks Marvel, which for those people who don't know, Aetherworks Marvel was a
4 colorless artifact, legendary artifact.
Correct.
That said, whenever a permanent you control is put into the graveyard, you gain an energy, and then you can tap it and pay 6 energy, I believe.
Spin the wheel, baby.
And spin the top 6 cards of your library, and then you can cast that card without paying its mana cost.
That's correct.
Which, tap and pay 6, excuse me. But that was...
It did say cast.
Yes, and it was a cast.
And that meant Ulamog.
Yep.
And he has a cast trigger.
And so...
It was broken.
Yeah, it was one of
Everybody
those
was playing it.
Everyone was playing it. It was a turn 4, basically a turn 4 win.
But I played it first.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that is true.
No, I mean... But seriously, I probably played it first. Anyway, not to be bravado or anything, but I'm always looking for meaningful creatures. I like to be able to synergize around meaningful creatures. I also love really heavy lockdown style decks, Punisher decks. I personally, as a Magic player and as a deck builder and as a brewer, will gravitate towards combos that are game breaking, right? And by combos, I mean that are game-breaking. It is either a damage lock, it is a fundamental play style lock, where we have outpaced our opponent so substantially that they cannot catch up to our draw potential or the creatures that we're resolving to the battlefield. What about you?
So for me, I like to basically find the cards that have such a unique effect, but are probably considered traps, and some of the sleeper cards that are in the meta right now, where, say, something like Old Growth Dryad.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that one right there is a perfect example where
I love that deck.
It's a trap card. It's 1 green for a 3/3 that allows your opponent to search for a land and put it on the battlefield.
This land is your land.
Right.
This land is my land.
So that card right there is a perfect example of a card that nobody wants to play, but here I go and I try to build a deck around it.
Yeah.
And another card that I could probably see myself building something around is like Apex of Power, right? Where it's basically... It's like 7 colorless, 3 red. You can exile the top 10 cards of your library. You get 10 red mana, and then you can...
cast any number of those that turn.
Yep.
Yeah.
Things like that, where they seem to have this really cool, big, flashy effect, but it's overcosted, or it's very dependent on the board state, or something like that. I like to build decks around that.
I mean, I feel like sometimes it's worthwhile asking the question, do we play cards that are in the meta? Do we play decks that are in the meta? And the answer is... Sometimes.
Yeah.
Most of the time we don't.
Yeah.
We will take cards that are seeing a lot of meta play and put them into our ideas. We will take meta popular cards and bend them to a new strategy or fit them into a new list because the value is obvious.
Right.
Right. And even as brewers, you got to go value town. Cards with value win games. We don't play the game to lose games.
Right.
We play games to win games.
And so going along with that, when we do play the meta lists, sometimes it's, if we're playing for keepsies and we're going to some sort of a championship or a tournament or something like that, well then, yeah, we'll heavily examine the meta. We'll continually test decks and find which list is the best. We'll probably tweak it a little bit to fit our play style a little bit more, and then we'll run those lists. But when it comes to like F&M decks, when we're really trying to piece together fun combos and things like that, we really look for those cards that aren't really seeing a whole lot of play, that we think just aren't getting a fair shake.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and again, sometimes I see you build these lists, I see you go maybe a little shy on the mana from where I think you should be, right? But I understand that you're trying to carve out correctly in terms of getting to what you know your deck is capable of, right? I also think that you find a really good balance in terms of the amount of lands, but the question you need to ask when you're brewing something new is how many lands do you actually run and what combinations of those lands do you actually run?
So, for me, I like to take a look at my overall curve of my deck. And if I'm running a mana curve where it's like 2.4 average converted mana cost, well then somewhere along the lines of like 21 to 23 lands is fine. If you're running a converted mana cost that's around 2.5 to 3.5,
yeah,
then you want to be running somewhere along the lines of 24 to 26 lands.
Explain what you mean by 2.5 to 3.5 in terms of mana cost.
Sure. So what you end up doing is you take all of your converted mana costs, you add them together, and then you divide them by 60, because 60 is the number of cards in your deck, and lands count as 0 converted mana cost. And that will give you the average converted mana cost for all the cards in your deck. You then take that, and if this number falls within these certain parameters, then this is kind of a guideline of how many lands you should probably be running in your deck.
I think that's where a lot of Magic players who are starting out, a lot of people who get into the standard meta, and I think there's really no better gift that we can give people for Christmas than helping them correct their mana curve.
Yeah.
One of the reasons professional poker players are drawn towards the game of Magic, or professional Magic players are drawn towards the game of poker, is that there are mathematical consistencies within drawing cards and seeing certain cards off of the top of the deck. After we've seen so many cards, those statistical odds of seeing the card that you're expecting to see increase exponentially, right? So we have some really interesting conversations to have there. Certainly as you balance out colors, we can talk more about how dual color cards require that you have an efficient mana base and the ability to use those mana slots to generate both colors of mana.
So how do you go about that? How do you decide, well, I need to be running, 10 blue sources.
I build a lot
sources.
of monocolored decks to save myself the hassle, just to be honest. And, I ask myself a lot of questions in terms of my deck building capabilities. Is it possible to actually be able to effectively curve out with multicolored decks without the proper mana base? But by and large, what I do is organize them by the total converted mana cost, what the end result of those specific colored mana cards are, and try to go above and beyond regarding efficiencies. For example, the reason I haven't totally dived into Jund, even though there's some Jund capable lists out there right now, is because we don't have the green-red and the black-red shocklands yet. We don't have those shocks available to us. However, when we do, that meets the speed curve and the desired types of creatures, which will come in the next set along with those lands.
Sure.
To be able to correct a lot of that. So what you end up getting is kind of pigeonholed into playing the available mana base and being competitive with the available mana base.
So it kind of seems like the lands dictate what types of decks you play in a certain standard meta.
There is no question about that.
Yeah.
There's no question about that whatsoever.
Right.
The fact that the available land base and the available color combinations on the color pie dictate the most effective decks, because Magic is all about consistency and being able to cast your spells. You could have the best combos available. You could have something that's completely meta breaking, but if you can't reliably cast it and you're finding cards stuck in your hand, you have not built an efficient deck.
Right.
Right?
So one of the ways that I like to find the right ratios of colors in my mana base. So JB was kind of touching on this a little bit. What I like to do is I like to see my total card list, find the number of cards from that list. Say it's 35 cards. And let's say 10 of those cards are red and 25 of those cards are blue. Okay. So what I like to do is I like to take 10 divided by 35, and that gives me my percentage of red sources.
Sure.
And then same thing for the blue, I would take 20 divided by 35, and that gives me the percentage for my blue sources. And then from there, I would just tweak it to whatever consistency level I needed to have, and that kind of helps, in my opinion, decide kind of where you need to be looking when it comes to what certain dual lands you need to be running, how many basics you need to be running, whether you need to be running something like Evolving Wilds to help you find a very specific land. Like if you're only running one Assassin's Trophy and you're running a black-red list.
You will certainly see the return of Evolving Wilds as we get into 3 to 5 color lands, right?
Right.
It thins the deck.
Right.
Specifically to help us get to those combo pieces faster. But when you're looking at 2 colored decks, Evolving Wilds becomes highly inefficient. especially when you have a mana base that's a buddy land plus the shock.
Right.
Shock's generally the turn one play, comes into play tapped. We accept that, and then our second dual land in terms of mana production comes down untapped. And then the flavor savers are, of course, the following basic lands.
Mm-hmm.
But mana curve aside, I think really putting that down on paper and showing some visual representations of that would substantially help those that are listening to the podcast.
And then also, does the type of deck that we're running kind of matter with how many lands we run?
What do you mean by that?
So if you think about it, if you're running like an aggro list, well, a lot of times the aggro lists are going to be a little bit lower to the ground. So you can kind of think in the back of your head, well, maybe I'll need maybe 20 to 24 lands for my aggro list.
Sure.
But then when you're thinking about like a control list, well, control decks want to be hitting their land drops.
They always want access to blue.
They need to be hitting their land drops. So they will often run maybe 24 to 27 lands, even if their converted mana cost curve doesn't necessarily need them to be running that many lands.
Correct.
So they'll be running more lands because they need to hit the lands.
Plus, most control decks also have an acceptable amount of churn that takes place.
Right. Yep.
Right, where they're drawing for discard, where they're using cards like Chart a Course, one colorless, one blue, draw 2 cards unless you attack with a creature, discard a card this turn, right? And so they will pitch those additional lands to dump them from their hand, to get to key spells, to be able to control the board, to get to Niv Mizzet, to be able to cast him, and then again, an acceptable amount of churn by using Draw a Course to activate the triggers on Niv Mizzet, ping ping kind of thing, and then Chemister's Insight, again, drawing, jumpstart, discard a land that they don't need in order to recast Chemister's Insight. So the lands and the higher mana base in those control style decks ends up becoming the fuel for the engine.
Right.
Right. How many removal cards do you think the average standard deck needs to run?
So depends on what type of deck you're running, but I like to run personally anywhere from 6 to 10. It depends on, like, if you're more of an aggro list, well, you're going to be running a lot more creatures than you will be running removal. A lot of times you'll be in like an aggro list, you'll be expecting that your creatures will chump block or do equitable trades on some of your opponent's creatures, and that'll act as removal.
Sure.
So you'll oftentimes run fewer removal spells for that, and the removal spells that you do run oftentimes will be able to do additional things like dealing damage directly to somebody's face, or being able to fix the top cards of your library, or something like that.
And one of the things that I really think that we got to focus on here is the fact that when you find special cards, right? Like for example, the mono red goblins list that's out there, you can find it at landsago.com. There's a goblins list there that I had posted. When you have creatures that act as removal and then also still represent that aggro, that's a very specific type of draw, right? Like for the goblins, they got Volley Veteran. It's 3 colorless, 1 red for a 4/2. When it comes into play, it deals damage equal to the number of goblins you control to target creature. So in that removal, when coupled with a Goblin War Chief, which is 1 colorless, 2 red, goblins you control cost 1 colorless less generic to play, and they have haste, you're talking about an incredibly effective removal creature combo, right? One of the reasons why Ravenous Chupacabra gets so much love is because it is targeted removal on the ETB trigger.
Right.
There's a number of creatures like that. Before rotation, we had creatures, Fiend Hunter going all the way back, right? Fiend Hunter does these really important things by exiling creatures for as long as it's in the battlefield, right? We will continue to see things like that, right? But that's where like that aggro strategy kind of blurs the line. Maybe you're using creatures and a removal package. You're not taking up slots in your deck for directed or targeted removal because your aggro strategy is supplementing some of that for you. So how many removal cards do you run? I think it depends upon the quality of your creatures and the type of deck you're playing. It's a very difficult question to answer.
What if you're playing like a control list? How would you differentiate between, like, you're playing a blue-black control list?
I would probably play 75 targeted removal cards and a blue-black control list. I would play nothing but removal and 30 lands and just sit there and annoy my opponent until I can resolve one big beater. No, but seriously, blue-black control, you've got to have enough counter spell quality cards as well to be able to kind of time walk your opponent and totally remove a turn on curve. Most talented Magic players will know that you're holding a counter up or that you're trying to feint one. And depending upon the type of deck that you're playing, you may need to commit to a line and push that counter spell out of their hand, knowing that what you're going to cast is going to be countered and have a backup plan to play through that strategy. Realistically, I think it all depends. Niv Mizzet, right now, Grixis Niv Mizzet is running 20 plus instant and sorceries that are not only board wipes, but targeted removal spells.
So that's a good question there too. So when we're looking at our removal spells, is there ever a time, say like in an aggro list, to be running a board wipe as well?
Sure.
So how would you make that determination?
Here's a perfect example. Okay. We've got cards like Deafening Clarion. Right? Dinosaurs are unique in that sometimes they have an enrage trigger, right? Let's say our dinosaurs have a fat enough bottom to survive a Deafening Clarion.
Deafening Clarion destroys all creatures.
No, Deafening Clarion deals 3 damage to all creatures.
Oh, no, you're right. I was thinking Cleansing Nova.
And they gain lifelink.
Yeah, you're right.
So in the case of 4-color or Naya dinosaurs, and we're playing like Ripjaw Raptors, Trapjaw Tyrants, we're playing these really interesting eclectic dinosaurs, then Deafening Clarion becomes a useful board wipe for you if you're dealing with an opponent that goes wide in terms of their strategy. And maybe the toughnesses on those creatures that they're running don't necessarily hold up to effectively a Sweltering Suns or an Anger of the Gods style card in Deafening Clarion. Plus the crackback on combat step after main phase 1 in casting the Deafening Clarion, 1 colorless, 1 red, 1 white, deal 3 damage to all creatures. Creatures you control gain lifelink that turn, and you can cast it for both. So in that combat step, you're putting even more real estate between the two of you. So in that instance, are you running board wipes while you're running creatures? Sure. Are there times where maybe in a monocolored list, like the Angels list that we started off the podcast talking about, where I would run Cleansing Nova? Never.
Well, maybe, because Cleansing Nova also has that added ability of being able to destroy enchantments and artifacts. But that might be like the meta would have to shift where there's more enchantment control or troublesome artifacts where you would want to run something like that.
Yeah, I could see that as well.
Now see, here's something where I kind of differ from you a bit.
Okay.
So for me, I am not afraid, say like in an aggro list, to run board wipes. And part of my reasoning behind this, it may be relegated to sideboard, but part of my reasoning behind not being afraid to run board wipes is that there are some games where all of a sudden I'm playing in a matchup where it's maybe a mid-range strategy against my aggro list, and they're able to handle my early board, and then they get down these giant creatures that I can't deal with. And then having that added resource of a board wipe in my hand, I'm okay losing a 1/1 or a 2/2 if I can kill 2 of their 5/5s.
It's kind of like an poop switch.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm okay personally if I'm running, say, 8 removal spells, having maybe 2 or 3 of those 8 removal spells be board wipe.
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
In certain decks that kind of works, especially we can bounce back quickly.
Right.
You know that in top deck mode, you're not in such a bad situation. Sure. Those types of board wipes become really, really good.
How many creatures would you run in a deck? I know it's that question of well, what type of deck are you running?
Correct.
Right.
We get back to what does it do?
Yeah. So if we're running an aggro list, how many creatures would you run?
38.
38?
22 lands.
Okay. 22 lands, 38 creatures.
Absolutely.
Hopefully 8 of your creatures has removal attached to it.
Sure.
So, okay. Well,
what type of aggro list? Mid-range? Up front?
Let's say a Boros strategy aggro list.
So red-white weenies.
Okay.
That championship style list.
Sure.
So we're looking at 30 creatures.
Okay.
6 spells, 6 or 7 spells that do other things, and then 23 to 24 lands.
And then what about like a mid-range list? How many creatures are we kind of looking at for just a rough guideline?
There's a mono white list that was floating around. I took this to F&M a while back. If you'll remember, we actually played over at Collector's Cache here in Lenexa, Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
But I took that mono white list over there. I was running 19 planes and 41 other cards.
That's true.
36 creatures and 5 spells. 4 copies of Gird for Battle, which puts a +1/+1 counter for 1 white mana on 2 creatures. And every one, the top of my curve was 3. And we just went ham.
Right.
Straight ham. Nothing but Rustwing Falcons and Healer's Hawks and a Sky Marcher Ascendants and Snubhorns and Legion's Landing and that whole thing. So that's a very unique situation where the mana curve is so excruciatingly low.
And you're also running, like you said, 19 lands. So that kind of goes again with that whole land ratio thing that we're talking about, where, like you're saying, you're at the top of your curve is 3 mana.
3 mana.
And so,
only 4 cards at that.
So your total converted mana cost average is probably around like 1.7 or 1.75.
That's right.
Maybe 2. And so you were able to get away with that 19, 20 land deck and not feel the burn of not drawing lands because it didn't matter if you drew another land.
I think philosophically a control deck is going to run their finishers in terms of the creature slot. Right.
So if that's the case, then are they only running like maybe 2 or 3 creatures?
4,
like
probably. Generally a play set of whatever their finisher is, or 2 or 3 of one finisher and 2 or 3 of another finisher. Let's harken back to the Torrential Gearhulk days here just before rotation. Mm-hmm. It was a play set of 4 Torrential Gearhulks and generally 2 other creatures of some type, if even that.
Right.
You know, that blue-black list that we see right now with Surveil, with some of what's going on with Doom Whisperer, even the chromatic black list that's floating around right now, that only runs 6 creatures, and the rest of it is literally all control and counter spells.
Yeah. So how about like card draw? Is there card draw for aggro lists?
Absolutely.
So what kind of things should we be looking for that?
Shaper Sanctuary, Shaper Sanctuary, Shaper Sanctuary. If you're playing green aggro list or decks with green in it, you can't really do much better than that. And you recently played a lot of Shaper Sanctuary, so why don't you get us up to speed on that card?
Sure. So really with the card draw, at least with aggro, there's a lot of different cards that at least in standard right now, that does draw us cards with creatures in mind. Shaper Sanctuary, as Jeremy said, is one of them. And that one is a 1 green mana. Whenever a creature is targeted by a spell or ability your opponent controls, you can draw a card. Mm-hmm. So when you start getting multiple downs, you can start drawing 2, 3, 4 cards, depending on how many of those you get down. And then there's also cards like Midnight Reaper, which is 2 and a black.
Perfectly acceptable.
Which is a 3/2 that says whenever a creature dies, you lose a life and you draw a card.
That's correct.
So it's
the Explore creatures, mm-hmm. right? That's effectively draw a card for aggro decks.
Yep, either a draw card or a buff. Mm-hmm. Right, and you can still fix the top card of your library.
That's correct.
So the aggro,
Mentor of the Meek.
Yep, aggro. Oh, that's a great example of card draw.
Absolutely.
On a creature. So Mentor of the Meek is 2 and a white. It's a 2/2. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, you can pay 1 mana and draw a card.
That's right.
So there's a lot of different options for creature decks to be able to draw cards, and don't be afraid to play them.
Agree.
You know, people will often shoehorn themselves into just playing the bombs or maybe just straight hasty aggro or something like that, and they end up missing out on this awesome card advantage that could really be beneficial to their deck and really help smooth out their draws, smooth out their lands, and help fight through, at least before sideboard, against things like the control decks or the counterspell decks, some of the mid-range decks that may have some answers for your early aggro, but you then have these answers to their answers to be able to draw cards to help fight through that.
You want to play a creature type or a tribal style deck and you want to be able to draw cards? Recommendation, Vanquisher's Banner is awesome. You can have
what does that do?
Vanquisher's Banner's 5 colorless artifact creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, and whenever you cast a creature of that type, you draw a card.
Mm-hmm. And also currently in the standard, we also have Beast Whisperer, which is 2 green for a 2/3. Whenever
Elves.
And it's an elf, but it says whenever you cast a creature, you can draw a card.
That's correct. He does find places there, and that is straight aggro synergy. And let us not forget the Immortal Sun.
Yep.
Which I think is a highly underplayed card. Yes, it makes it into some sideboards for a lot of the meta decks, but Immortal Sun is incredibly powerful. I think it's only going to continue to rise in price. That would be a ding, ding, ding investment notice from Land Say Go.
I would pick that up right now if you haven't already. It's not going to get any lower, especially when standard rotates. It's going to find home in other metas as well, especially Commander. It's one of those cards that's going to just continually go up in price.
I think a lot of times you try to build a lot of different options into your deck. You like to see options from different sources. You like to really kind of balance out that mana. But what about play sets? I feel like sometimes you think I should be running less cards, and I find myself running a lot of 4-ofs.
Well, for me, I'm not opposed to 4-ofs. In fact, I like to say to new players who are starting standard, play as many play sets as you can, because the consistency is so important.
Gets you used to your combos.
It gets you to your combos. It helps you get creatures that you need on curve, on time. It gets you to your spells that you need on curve, on time. It's all about the curve, and having those play sets really help you with the consistency with that.
What about 1-ofs and 2-ofs? Is it possible for us to take a Brawl deck and do an F&M standard night and win?
Yes.
Okay. Why?
But it depends on the types of cards that
I wasn't
you're running.
expecting that answer. Okay, give me why. Right. Go ahead.
So let's say we're running a control list.
Okay.
So is it okay if we run, say, playset of Syncopate, a playset of Essence Scatter, and 2 negates?
Sure.
Okay, now what if we add in 1 Devious Cover-Up?
Oh, I'd love that.
So
just to have that one whammy.
Right. So Devious Cover-Up is a 2 blue. When you cast it, counter target spell, you can then shuffle in 3 cards from your graveyard and put it back into your library.
Good spell.
So it's a 4-mana counter spell, and you normally don't want to be running 4-mana counter spells, but it has such a great effect to be able to help fuel you for future things. You may want to consider running 1, maybe 2, but you don't want to run 3. Because you don't want to have it fill your hand. Yeah. You don't want to run 4 because you don't want to see it in your opening hand. So there are times when running 1 or 2 cards of a specific card is okay. And really how I like to think of it is if you run 1 of a card, if you see it, great. If you don't, your other cards are fine.
Didn't really matter.
Right.
It's not what we're chasing anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're running 2, you want to see it, but if you don't see it, it's okay.
Yeah.
If you're running 3, you do want to see this card, but you don't want to see it in your opening hand, or you're opening 2 or 3 hands. And if you're running 4 of a card, you're hoping to get it in your opening hand.
Yeah, you want to see it on the draw.
Yeah.
So it's an anchor.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I like to think about these cards when I'm running play sets or not. And another good example is maybe in a control strategy is running maybe 1 or 2 of a certain bomb and then 1 or 2 of another bomb. For instance, if we're running against a deck that's playing Ixalan's Binding, well, we don't want to be running 4 of, say, 1 creature that's our finisher. If the Ixalan's Binding and we have no way of being able to getting rid of that card,
which is why that card is so powerful,
then all of a sudden we're out of luck. Well, if we're running 4 different one-ofs
finishers
that are top-end finishers, well, if the Ixalan's Binding went, oh, well, I got 3 other ones I can find.
Boy, I'm glad he cast that on that.
Yeah, right?
That feels much, much better.
So it is okay if you run 1-ofs or 2-ofs.
Let's wrap this up discussing how we find our synergies that are breaking up the metagame.
Sure. When you look at your cards, let's say we're running Jeremy's Angels list. So he's running cards that will gain him life.
They fly.
They fly.
Evasive attacks.
So when we're trying to find synergies and say something like Jeremy's Angels list, he ended up running an interesting card, a Danto Vanguard, which is 1 and a white. We went into it earlier. But you can pay 4 life to make it indestructible.
Yep.
When you're looking at this, well, all of a sudden, it's not gaining you life, and you don't necessarily have a payoff for gaining life, except you have a threat that can continually make itself indestructible so long as you're gaining life.
That's correct.
So it's kind of like a hidden strategy that you may not have thought of before, but all of a sudden it fits when you kind of fit it in the right deck. Another one may be running something like Tormenting Voice or Pirate's Pillage in a Reanimator deck.
Yeah, Pirate's Pillage is great in a Reanimator deck. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a card that I think that you found some really acceptable uses for recently. We're starting to see more of that card in the meta, and that's just because functionally it represents substantial tempo. Mm-hmm. In terms of being able to generate 2 pieces of mana in any color in the pie. It becomes draw advantage, it's mana advantage, it's artifact, it's permanent advantage. It's just a really sleeper style card that fits into so many things when you start really thinking about some of the deeper lines that are there.
Right. So it's when you look at a card, in order to find the synergy, you want to basically ask yourself, what does this card do? What does it need to be successful?
And I'll tell you how you do that. You pull up one of these sites like Gatherer or Scryfall. You pull up all the cards in a set and you actually study.
Yep.
You sit there and you read the cards.
As the saying goes, reading the card explains the card.
That's correct. And when you read all of the cards in a set, or you take the time to read all of the cards in standard, just through that action. And when you start drawing those lines and interconnecting the capabilities of cards, and you actually apply yourself to the study of Magic, those lines automatically connect themselves. You will find that you start to have these aha moments, right? You start to see the depth You maybe come up with some combos that you're not seeing out there. You get excited about it. You build the deck. You take it to F&M. You 5-0. You come home. You built that list. You brought that to the community. That's what really matters. It's the study. It's the practical application of the art.
And so kind of just, again, piggyback off that, if you study the card and you really understand what this one card needs to be successful, the cards that you want to build around, that you found a unique effect about, say it's like Yawgmoth's Vile Offering. Well, that needs a creature or a planeswalker in a graveyard. Well, how do you go about building that? Well, you need to have a way to either kill your opponent's creatures or
Stitcher
planeswalkers.
Supplier is perfect.
Or fill your own graveyard. Stitcher Supplier is a great example. Well, now we need also to cast this, because it's a legendary sorcery, we need to be running legendary permanents, like a legendary creature and a planeswalker.
Sure.
So we have to be able to be running enough of those creatures to be able to make it viable. So it's one of those things where you just have to really look and dive down. Well, what legendary creatures or legendary planeswalkers matter in this type of a strategy?
We have to do it cheaply, effectively, on curve, in a way that benefits us more than it does our opponents.
Exactly. And lastly, JB, do you have any last minute tips or tricks to be able to help fight through the metagame?
I think that what you need to do is, again, earlier in the conversation tonight when we're kind of talking about this, look at what everybody's playing, look at what is really 5-0ing consistently, and look what everybody's not playing, and take in something that's a total disruption to the meta. The reason Angels went 5-0 at F&M is because nobody was expecting a deck to come that was mono white, not dependent on dual sources of mana, that was not restricted by having to play tempo, that had its own game plan. And what that game plan was a recursive threat in a Johnny, a potential ultimate, the ability to block with flying creatures, the ability to attack with flying creatures, and a deck that represented an early aggro strategy and then bombed them on the top end, right? Every one of the creatures that we're playing flies until we sideboard in the Adanto Vanguards, and only then against aggro matchups. But because all of my damage was flying, it caused my opponents to drain their hand of their removal on the early creatures, on the Ajani's. And what they missed out on was the Lyras and the Light of the Legion and the Sarah's Guardians. They missed out on the top-end kill switches for my deck that substantially punished them for not holding back those resources, right? Niv Mizzet does not trade equitably with a 6/6 flying lifelinker. He just doesn't. And when you can get your opponent on their back heel, they've burned all of their removal and taken care of the early aggro strategy, and you drop a 6/6 flying lifelinker onto the battlefield, it does not feel good for them. Then they are chump blocking with the anchor, the core piece of their deck. And with the life gaining capabilities, we didn't care if our opponents were trying to run or flood the board on the bottom side, because we were just going to go right over the top of their head.
So TLDR, look at what the meta is currently playing and basically play the opposite.
That is correct. Brew new stuff.
Yep.
Break the meta. Think about cards and combinations and colors that are not seeing love right now, and do that. I think more often than not, you'll surprise yourself.
Yep.
All right, guys. Well, I think that does it here. A late Merry Christmas to all of you. This episode is released on Thursday. It is currently a late Saturday night for Debo and I. From our households to yours, from our friends and our local game shops to yours. Hope you have a happy holidays, a Merry Christmas, and a very, very special New Year's. And we will see you in 2019.